The title of the paper is on the slide, How Permeable Are State Borders Worldwide? And this research question is part and parcel of a larger research program that I've been directing at the Migration Policy Center of the UI in Florence over the past 3-4 years, the Global Mobilities Project, which has already produced research on transnational mobility flows on a global scale with a dedicated data set, the Global Transnational Mobility Data Set, and research on the cost of visas, all types of visas, again, with a global scope from and to all possible nations worldwide. And there again, we have a data set which is released openly and available from our website at MPC, the global visa cost data set. We think that visa and borders are key pieces of a migration equation. If you want to know how easy, how extensive mobilities worldwide, we need to know more about visas and borders. And now today we concentrate on borders. Research on borders is not new, it's quite developed. Borders shouldn't be considered to be like sealed walls or open fields. Actually, all borders are something in between. I like very much my colleague Stephen Mau's definition. Borders are sorting machines for people and for goods as well, because the exchange of goods is also part of transnational movements. But when it comes to people, there are at least 3 different approaches to the study of borders. There is a social legal approach, which digs deeper into the legislation and the procedures that are used by states to delimit and also handle border management and border control. There is a more culturalist strand of research that focuses on the socio-cultural construction and meaning making of borders, and thus going beyond borders between states, but also thinking of borders within states. And there is a final, more realistic stream of research on border fortification that looks at barbed wires or walls that have been proliferating in the last decades worldwide. Our approach is somewhat different, although closer to the last one I mentioned. We think that walls are not the key point defining or making borders more or less easy to cross. In fact, what we need to know more and in a more systematic way is the whole set of infrastructure that exists at borders. So the roads, the paths, the railways, the ferries, the bridges, and the checkpoints that make borders actually crossable by people. So I have a couple of examples here to clarify why we underscore the importance of walls. For instance, the Berlin Wall, when it fell down the day after, actually didn't fall down, the gates were open. So what really changed was the fact that checkpoints were no longer checkpoints. The gates were open, and so the border was much more permeable the day after the metaphorical fall of the wall rather than the day before. And the second example is more updated, up to date. It's in Africa. In 2021, a bridge was opened between Zambia and Botswana, the Kazungula Bridge, and this was a game changer for people living next to these borders to go from Zambia and Botswana and vice versa. So if we only looked at the fortifications, we wouldn't be able to capture the facility with which that particular border can be crossed at different times. I have a series of images that stylize the types of land borders, because we are focusing on land borders and not other type of borders that one may find on this planet between existing nation states. Panel A shows an impermeable border. There is a border, but there is nothing to cross the border. There is no road, there is no railway, no bridge. In panel B, we have at least one road. In panel C, we have several roads. In panel D, we also have a railway, and increasing number of roads and infrastructures makes obviously that border more porous, more permeable. But in panel E, we see that there is a checkpoint which lowers the permeability of the border. And in panel F, eventually we see a number of red dots, and the red dots are several checkpoints. And so, but panel F, the situation in panel F is a situation in which crossing the border is possibly as problematic as it is in panel A. We try to, and we want to formalize all these possible, let's say, ideal typical situations with a formula. And the formula is what we have called the Border Permeability Index, BPI, which is a very intuitive index. It's a ratio. It's a ratio between I, the number of border crossings served by transport infrastructure, that is all the roads, railways, paths crossing the borders, minus the number of checkpoints. The number of checkpoints is multiplied by a factor E, which stands for enforcement, the degree of enforcement of checkpoints, which is something I anticipate we don't manage to know, but we can assume that it varies from 0 when the checkpoint is empty. Actually, it's not guarded. There are no soldiers or police at the checkpoint, to 1 when the checkpoint is heavily guarded and nobody is entitled to cross that border. We divide these by the length of the border, and we use a factor S to standardize the index between 0 and 1. And our goal is to have a BPI, that is a score for each and every land border on this planet. So what kind of data we use to construct to calculate this index? We used existing digital maps that can be freely downloaded online, OpenStreetMap, Harvard World Map, and also some data on checkpoints released by the World Food Program for Africa. So we eventually could have information on 312 land borders worldwide, basically all land borders worldwide. And we have a standard cluster of measurement that is, we monitor every 500 meters of each borderline. This means that in 500 meters, we find 2 roads. We calculate those 2 roads as 1, okay? This is our clustering procedures. Basically, what we want to know is whether you find a cross-border infrastructure every 500 meters of the borderline. These open map digital tools give us information about 38 different types of infrastructures, which differ in their capacity to let traffic flow. So we have highways, we have secondary roads, we have footways, we have, I don't know, bike paths. And we, in part of analysis, we weigh these infrastructure in terms of their capacity to channel a larger or a lower amount of people and goods. Initially, we didn't do these manually. We automated the process. I'm guilty of not mentioning the co-authors of this paper. I'm not the only author, actually. The primary author is Emanuel Deutschmann at the University of Flensburg. And the third author is Lorenzo Gabrielli at CNR in Italy, and also associated with the Migration Policy Center, as well as Emanuel Deutschmann, and also associated with the Joint Research Center currently of the European Commission. We also acknowledge support from the JSC and particularly from Michele Vespe. So the data scientist among us, namely Lorenzo Gabrielli, automated the process by combining the geometries representing land borders and transport infrastructures and checkpoints, and intersecting the lines of infrastructures with the line that represent the borders. And with this technique, it could assign or detect the presence or absence of infrastructure for every, as I said, 500 meters of the border. We did some manual check of these automated procedure, and using QGIS. And actually, we realized quite soon there were quite a lot of false positives, actually roads that the system classified as cross-border roads, but in fact ended a few meters of very, very close to the border. And so these had to be deleted from our data set, but also false negatives in more or less the same amount. That is cross-border infrastructures that went unnoticed by the automated procedures. In particular, the automated procedure did not recognize ferries. And so we had to include ferries whenever you have, for instance, straits or rivers to the list of our cross-border infrastructure. So at the end of the day, this was a lengthy and quite careful work. In the final data set, about 1/4 of the information comes from manual coding. We have here some maps showing all the borders and where you have roads and paths, railway, mostly in Europe, checkpoints all over the place, and particular checkpoints in Africa provided by the World Food Programme. So, as I was saying, in our data set, we have information about more than 30,000 border crossing infrastructures, which are distinguished into different types, from road to special road, to railway, to ferries, and also information about more than 2,500 checkpoints, okay, distinguished by land borders, along all possible land borders. And now I come to the results. If we stick to the border permeability index, which shows how easy it is to cross the land border, we see that by far the index is higher in Europe and in Africa than in other continents, but particularly in Europe. Panel A and B show the distribution of the index at various possible degrees of enforcement or checkpoints. Remember that this is an unknown level, an unknown variable in our equation. But if we assume that enforcement varies from 0 to 1, we see that the differences are not that relevant. The only continent in which the level of enforcement makes a difference in the index is North America. Why? Because North America, look at panel D, is also the continent in which you find, on average, the larger number of checkpoints, about 16 checkpoints every 1,000 kilometers. So here we have countries with a higher BPI, the higher permeability of borders. There is little surprise that on top of the world ranking, we have European borders, and particularly European borders with tiny nation states. So the border between Spain and Andorra, between Slovenia and Austria, between Luxembourg and France, Liechtenstein and Austria. We present two rankings here. One, again, imagining that checkpoints are left open, as is the case within the EU in normal circumstances because of a Schengen agreement. And on the right side of the slide, we repeat the exercise setting the level of enforcement of checkpoints to 1. So assuming that checkpoints are fully guarded and passage is almost impossible, but still you see that the ranking doesn't change much. There are some African countries, possibly the most surprising couple of countries, or the most surprising border is the border between Israel and the Palestinian territories. In our imaginary, is a very hard border to cross, but in fact, in normal times, when enforcement of checkpoints is low, there are many border crossings. And so this is one of the most densely served border in terms of infrastructures on the planet. On the other side of the spectrum, the borders which are the most difficult to cross, we have borders that are mostly characterized by deserts or forests, so in which you don't have any infrastructure to cross. This doesn't mean that you cannot cross it, but it's naturally hard to cross these borders. For instance, the border between Guyana, that is France, and Brazil, or the border again between Peru and Brazil, but also borders that are in fact very much controlled. It's a case of United States and Mexico, and Turkey and Greece. The minimum values are 0. There are some negative coefficients. I can tell you why later on if you're interested. It's a little technicality. We conclude this presentation by trying to unravel what are the factors that help explain why some borders are more permeable than others. And we take into account 4 types of factors. First, economic development. We expect the borders to be tighter and less easy to cross when you have a high differential in prosperity between 2 countries. Then we expect borders to be more permeable when the countries are rich, because if they are rich, they may have a higher interest in exchanging and favoring also trade. We also introduce a square term to check for curvilinear effects, and anticipate that curvilinear effects are quite substantial. Then we take into account political factors. How many intergovernmental organizations the two countries are joint members of? And we expect that if they cooperate in the same supranational organizations, the two countries should have more open borders. And we also check for the Economist Democracy Index. Then we take account the level of population mobility, transnational mobility between the two countries, leveraging our pre-existing global transnational mobility dataset, which I mentioned at the outset, and the tourist visa cost that we recorded also as part of our GMP project, and also population density of the two countries, assuming that when you have dense population close to the borders, this population may want to move around regardless of state borders. And finally, two cultural indicators, the fact that the two countries across the border share the same language or share the same religion. And here are the results. We analyze, or we consider, we run models for the four separate type of predictors: economic predictors, political predictors, mobility predictors, and cultural predictors. Cultural predictors don't work, don't make a difference. Mobility does to some extent, and particularly the density of the population of the two countries. Political factors matter a bit. Economic development matters a lot in two senses. Countries, poorer countries have more porous borders, more permeable borders. Why? Because actually they don't have much to defend, possibly, and they cannot afford to set up a lot of infrastructures or a set of checkpoints. But if you look at the GNI, the gross national income squared, you see that countries that are on top of a income distribution worldwide also have more permeable borders. So it's the poorest and richest countries that tend to have more permeable borders. Having said this is not the case when they are neighboring countries, and when there is a gap in gross national income, this makes borders on average significantly less permeable, but not to the extent, honestly, that we expected. The last model in the slide is the full model, including all sets of predictors and excluding the cultural predictors because they were proven not to be significant. And basically, the results that I illustrated are confirmed, with the only difference that political factors no longer are significant. So I'm reaching my conclusion. We think that using geographical information, and especially in automated way, digitized way, with API to get information about the structure of borders is substantial innovation methodologically in border research. As for results, we find that Europe and Africa have the most permeable, and the Americas, and particularly North America, the least permeable borders worldwide. As we expected, economic imbalances between countries make for tighter borders, but this is not so important compared to the level of economic development. Very rich countries and very poor countries have more permeable borders. This responds to different mechanisms. Rich countries aim for exchanges, poor countries don't have a lot of infrastructures. They simply cannot afford to close the borders. There is this An important caveat that I want to raise before concluding, checkpoints are an important component of our index, and we only have rather rough information about checkpoints. We know we can detect from open maps existing and stable checkpoints, but we know nothing about the level of enforcement of these checkpoints, and we cannot detect what are called sometimes flying checkpoints, which are particularly widespread, for instance, in hot borders or sensitive borders like the borders between Israel and Palestine. But we still think that our border permeability index is a good starting point to study a number of different mobility-related phenomena. First of all, migration, but also tourism, and non-negligibly also the capacity of countries to seal the borders and protect themselves from the spread of epidemics, as became topical in very recent years. Thanks a lot.